Philipp'sh Goojbye. For the first time in 2 weeks, the engine shed doors were opened. I hope you are sorry, I said to the miserable faces of Gordon, Eunice, James, Henry, and Mildred, and understand that you are not so important after all. Our new station pilot, Percy, has taken over Thomas's branch line, while Thomas and Edward have worked the main line nicely.
By themselves? Impossible!
Spluttered Eunice. But she quickly subsided into silence, and I chose to ignore her outburst. I will let you out now, I said, if you promise to be good. And please remember, this no shunting nonsense must stop. The 5 big engines agreed. As they were being steamed up, I went to speak to Edward. I want to thank you, Edward. You played a big role in getting my railway through a difficult period. I'm reopening another branch line, the one that stems from the station before Gordon's Hill. As a reward, you shall run it. Edward was delighted.
May I take Beetle and his brothers, sir?
Why not? I smiled. They seemed to have taken a liking to you. I then told Percy and Philip that they could go play on Edward's new branch line for a few days, while the big engines did their own shunting. Thomas, whose tender had been removed, had gone off to fetch Annie and Clarabelle. The 2 old coaches were pleased to have him back, and he took them for a run on his branch line at once. Edward and Percy played with China clay trucks. They were surprised when Philip arrived and started to join in.
Philip, what are you doing here?
Gasped Edward.
Sir Topham Hatt said,
Philip began.
You've got to leave, now,
insisted Edward.
Remember, the big engines are not to know we had help running the main line.
But go on, snapped Percy.
Back to the other railway where you belong.
And so Philip made his way back to the main line. Not long after Philip left, Edward regretted being so hasty.
We should have thanked him for his help, he said sadly. We couldn't have kept the railway running without him. But if the big engines find out he was here, they'll know you and Thomas couldn't manage, and they'll start walking over Sir Topham Hatt again, reminded Percy.
Meanwhile, at the big station, the big engines were happy to be back at work. They felt stiff and glad of a chance to get some exercise. Most of them didn't much care how 2 little engines had done all their work in 2 weeks, but Eunice was still suspicious. James left first with a passenger train, followed by Eunice with the goods. Dickie and Tamara kept their word and said nothing about Thomas's tender or Philip coming to pitch in with the workload. James was enjoying his journey. He was glad to see each station he stopped at. He was so pleased to see the station before Gordon's Hill again that he hadn't noticed anything unusual in the shunting yard next to it. Philip was hiding there. He'd just come from Edward's branch line, and the station mistress had warned him that James was coming. Philip watched as James left the station. When he was out of sight, he ventured from the sidings and waited for the Eau Claire to proceed. But he hadn't made it far along the main line before a signaller halted him near the scrapyard.
What's going on?
Demanded the driver.
We've got to get to the main line without being seen by any of the big engines. Sorry, but Eunice is approaching with a goods train. I've forgotten how fast she could be, said the signaller. You must wait in that siding to let her pass.
Oh dear, Philip groaned as he backed into the siding. Thomas had told him about how gossipy Eunice was.
If she sees me, the rest of the big engines will know in no time.
He had just entered the siding by the scrapyard when he heard Eunice's whistle. Soon, the goods train came rattling by. Philip tried not to look at Eunice, but he couldn't help it. He caught her eye. She looked quite shocked. Soon the tail lamp of her train faded out of sight. The signaller walked up.
You'll never get past her and James at the other end of the line now. You'll have to go back to Edward's branch and head back to the other railway tonight.
Edward was glad to see Philip return so soon, but Percy wasn't.
What if
Eunice saw me? Philip admitted. It's all over. Edward tried not to let this upset him. I shouldn't have shooed you away.
Come, help us with these trucks.
Philip felt a little better, and he, Edward, and Percy went on shunting until the China clay wagons were tidily arranged. When darkness fell, Edward and Percy said goodbye and thank you to Philip, and the black rusty engine set off along the main line towards the other railway. Edward, for the first time in 2 weeks, went to the engine shed. He was surprised to find that none of the big engines were talking about Philip. They all seemed to be in high spirits. He looked at Eunice. She looked troubled.
What's the matter, Eunice?
Asked James.
You've not said a word.
Eunice gulped.
I know how Sir Topham Hatt has been covering the shortfall. He's been bringing condemned mainland engines over here to be scrapped.
The other big engines gasped and looked at Edward, who said nothing.